Hi, I want to talk to you about MetaPrompting. And so a lot of times what we do when we prompt ChatGPT or whatever is we'll give it a problem, say, hey, create 6 user stories from it. And then that's typically where we stop, right? We have 6 user stories. They look pretty good. They follow the right format. And we might go ahead and pop those into Jira or put them on a whiteboard and then start to work with the team to refine the stories. But there are ways that you can use the ChatGPT and other products like that, whether you're using Claude or whatever. If you watch my other videos, that I'm a huge fan of ChatGPT, and that's what I use. And I'll use that in these examples. But again, you can use any of the library, Claude, Microsoft Copilot. They're escaping me because I love ChatGPT so much. All right. Anyway, so let's get into this. All right. So what we're going to do is let's assume that we've already talked to our business stakeholder and we have a really good problem statement or an epic, something that we're going to start with. If we have time at the end, I'll go to a technique that's pretty cool to create a GPT that helps you create problem statements, but that's if we have time at the end. All right. So here's what I want to do. I want to walk through this collaboration, right? This is a typical collaboration, right? Product owner will come in. They may take an initial cut at the user stories, and then they'll look at the user stories and the idea, and they'll go to a UX designer, maybe do some wireframing, and then think about it, then have a senior developer get the team together and review the user stories and point out maybe any technical risks and refine the stories, start talking about acceptance criteria. Then your solution architect will come in and look at the user stories and how they fit into the solution flow or the architecture, and they'll help with some refinement. Then bay engineers, right? You think about the three amigos, right? We would get 3 people in the room, usually a tester, developer, and product owner, and you would walk through and you would do it three amigos and you break down stories. And then Scrum Master would come in and start to bring team together, point to stories, and make sure we have good prioritization before going to planning. Then at this point, we want a user acceptance tester to come in to look at integration testing across, as we get the sprint done, how we're going to do integration testing with other things that already exist in our environment. And then product owner gets back involved, takes a look at everything, makes sure priority is good. And then at this point, we would bring it into a developer, and developer would write the code. Now, obviously, they're probably involved in the process with senior developer and then go through that. So what we want to do is talk about how do we go through and you can do this on your own, or you can collaborate, right? There's no reason why you can't pop up ChatGPT when you're at a refinement session and work through stories, ask questions, and use it as a way to help you document the stories. So let's talk about what this would actually look like, right? So the product owner is going to come in, and like I said, we're going to go through and we're actually going to do this in ChatGPT as we go along, right? Let me pop up ChatGPT. All right. I'll make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. Zoom in just a little bit. All right. Now, let me see. So my kind of bottom of the screen. And yeah, I had too many tabs open. So what are we going to do? So remember, we're going to start off with the product owner, and I'm going to copy and paste these prompts in. I'll give you a link to this Google Sheet, but we're going to come in and we're going to say this. All right. So you're the product owner for an e-commerce app. Write 3 concise, clearly defined Agile user stories for a feature allowing users to track the orders in real time. All right. And so I'm going to go off and create user stories for you. So there you go. So you got user story 1. I want to view the current status, ship product, right? It seems to make sense. Some basic acceptance criteria and bullet points, user story. All right. So they go through. So that's cool, right? So that's your first cut. They don't look too bad. But now what we want to do is we come in and we want to shift our persona for how we're viewing the user stories, right? So remember our flow, we're going to go to the UX designer now. And I'll give you these prompts. I want you to go through them on your own and actually read the stories. And I'll try to point out how things are different or become different as you go through the stories. But the idea is that now what you're going to do is you're going to look at it from a UX design standpoint. You're going to say, okay, from a designer standpoint, what are some of the things that I'm going to want to do looking at these user stories? How can I create wireframes? Now, there are other versions of tools, like I'm pretty sure that Figma now has AI built into it. So what can happen is that the UX designer can now document the type of flow, right? Real-time order tracking should be intuitive at a glance, reduce cognitive load. And so then talk about, you can have an orders tab, order confirmation, call to order, right? So this would just be like a UX designer going through and thinking about how they would build the front end for this app. Now, again, they could at this point take it into Figma or something like that and actually design real working wireframes. And the Figma tools, it goes fairly quickly, right? So now you have the UX designer, and ChatGPT now can create visual mockups, but I don't want to distract from the flow, right? What we want to do is we want to go from UX design, and now they're starting to add in their information. And so now you're going to come into a senior developer and say, as a senior developer, what do I typically do, right? I'm going to critically evaluate each story for clarity, feasibility, and completeness. And then I'm possibly going to help rewrite the stories, right? And this is where you can be collaborating together if you want, or take a cut at it, right? I want details, and I want to flag any potential risks, the technical risks, right? And so these are things. So if you think about what's happening is I created the user stories as a product owner. And now what I'm going to do as a senior developer, I'm going to review those stories. So you're asking the model to review the stories and then to go in and actually rewrite them, right? So from the original story, track shipment details, that's generally clear. Feasibility depends on the integration with shipping. Do we want FedEx, UPS? And it's not really complete. It doesn't specify what systems trigger changes, right? And so it goes through and it identifies the things that are probably missing from the user story, right? So here goes. And so now your senior developer is going to help rewrite the stories. And so as a logged in user, I want to give real-time updates of my place store orders across standard delivery phases, place, confirm, ship, out for delivery, and delivered, so that I can understand where my order is in the fulfillment process. Acceptance criteria, right? Starting to bulleted. Statuses are updated via webhooks. Technical notes, integrate with extended carriers. In-house, right? Risks, delays and inconsistencies of third-party status data. Need caching layer to reduce pulling overhead, right? These are things that are typically going to be notes that a developer, senior developer will put on, right? And so now you can see that our user stories are getting a little bit more robust, starting to have a little bit more clarity, and we're adding in acceptance criteria. And the key thing here is, what are the risks, right? These are the things we have a tendency to, developer may bring them up, but they don't necessarily get documented. Obviously, this one's huge, right? We've all seen this. Delays in data that we expected to look a certain way and it doesn't, right? And so you can see again that they're getting beefier and beefier. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come in, and as a solution architect, we're going to review the stories as a solution architect. So again, think about what we typically do, or what would typically happen. You would come in and just say, hey, generate user stories for me. Now what we're doing is we're going through a process, and we're asking the model to look at the stories in a different light and to do its own analysis on it based on its patterns and understanding how to build user stories. And that, not only that, but order tracking systems in general. What are the type of things that you would typically want to see in there? So then now as a solution designer, I'm going to think about the high level technical design for implementing these user stories and any integration points and data flow, right? So here's the feedback from the solution architecture. So the architecture consists of front end, an API gateway, right, to the back end, probably microservices for order service, tracking, notification, user preferences, external integrations, and data layer, right? Rational database. And at this point, if you've been using ChatGPT or something, you could actually feed in your technical architecture, or you could feed in an architecture document. But you can see this is easy enough for a solution architect could take this in. And if they're not using, let's say, if they're not using PostgreSQL, what SQL database are they using? And they would plug that in there, right? And actually, the technical details of what it is, developers already know. So just understanding that we want to separate it out by integration, microservices, and the data layer is already leading us in a good direction. And so now he's going to talk about the flow that he would think that this goes through. I'm assuming the solution architect is male. It could be female. So as order is placed, it goes through a tracking and it's identifying. Again, these are things that as we go do story refinement, we remember this, right? Where people talk through and they'll work through the solution. And what they're doing is they're trying to fess out other user stories, right? So now the user stories are getting better defined, status flow changes, and then even to the point where it'll give you a high level document, right? And so some non-functional considerations, deployment recommendations. So again, it's very helpful. It's going to say, do you want me to help you transform it? But we're not going to get distracted. We're going to continue down this path, right? So now what we want to do is take a look at it as a QA engineer. Again, what we're talking about is MetaPrompting and something called prompt chaining. This is what, when you see these robust applications and chatbots that you're using, what's happening is behind the scenes, they're actually chaining together. So what that means is they're taking a prompt and or programmatically doing what you're doing by hand, or what I'm doing by hand here, where I say, hey, create user stories. And then in the back end, I would tell the system, evaluate these user stories as a solution designer. And so it would keep refining the stories based on the role or the viewpoint that I had it look at it, right? So now as a QA engineer, using the refined stories, let's generate specific acceptance criteria, and let's use a Gherkin format and unit tests to validate that org tracking feature works as intended. Now, the reason I want to use Gherkin is if you've used Gherkin before, what it is, it's a behavior-driven development process. And the Gherkin format it's an English language format for acceptance criteria. And typically I'll have in examples and edge cases, and developers can use it just like they use TDD, but it has a tendency with Gherkin and BDD, it's more of an outside in view. So more acceptance criteria. So you can write it by user story, or you could take it and logically group user stories into a series of Gherkin feature files, right? So that's why we want to use that to give it some sort of structure in the output. And if you recall, when you're doing prompts, you want to make sure that if it's something structured, now user story format is pretty well known and a Gherkin format is well known. So I don't have to describe what the Gherkin format looks like. And you can see that ChatGPT understands it. And this is the syntax of a Gherkin file, right? So the feature, order status tracking. Here's a scenario. Display updated order status. So given a user is placed an order, when the carrier updates the shipping status to shipped, then the order status on the order detail page should display shipped, right? So it's very clear, right? So you're going to write code to make that scenario pass. And then you're going to write code to make this scenario pass. Show all status transitions with timestamps. Given a user views their order detail page, when the status history is retrieved, then each status step should display its name and timestamp. So you can see this is the type of acceptance criteria that be nice for the developers to have. And then it's going to create some unit tests. Now these tests can be copied and pasted directly into the development environment, right? So if somebody's got a visual code project, visual code is a common IDE, right? So, but a integrated development environment that a developer use, right? So Visual Studio Code, they typically have a folder that's called tests. These tests would exist in there. And again, with test-driven development, it would be red, green refactor. So you could drop these in right now, run the tests, and they would fail because you haven't written any code. But that's the process that you want to go to. So now, while we're talking about the stories, we're actually creating the integration tests that are going to be used in the live environment, right? So you can see the kind of time that you're saving, right? And so now we go to user story 2, same thing. Here's the acceptance criteria. So this is more the behavioral stuff. So you could see where you could test this what I call headless. So you go underneath the IDE and then just testing the API directly. So call, we have the microservices and database layer. You could test behind it, or in a lot of cases, you'll see people actually use products like Selenium that'll drive UI and it'll click buttons and things like that. So you see that. And so it goes ahead and creates those unit tests. And same thing, acceptance criteria unit test. Then it just gives you a summary of what it did. All right. So that was the QA engineer looking at it, right? So you can imagine, again, the collaboration process that we typically went through. But what we're doing is we're just refining stories using the model, right? So using ChatGPT to give us hints. Again, no reason why you can't have your team together while you're doing this. You can, if you use Lucid Charts, you can cut and paste. So you can ask ChatGPT to give you a list that you can import and create sticky notes for you. So now the next meta prompt is, so now we're going to look at it as a Scrum Master. We want to facilitate story point estimation for the stories and identify any dependencies or potential impediments. Now, the interesting thing is at this point, use story reference, for example, 5 to help calibrate. So in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to come in and take its own cut, right? And again, the nice thing about this is the model has all this code that it's seen and the time that it takes to build the code. And so it's going to come up with average, what it would consider the story points for getting this done. Now, the other thing that you can do is if you know your team really well, and let's say in some organizations I've seen where teams would actually go through and do an analysis and say, hey, typically a 5-point story takes us 2 days. So 16 hours, whatever. If you give that type of feedback to the LLM before you get to this point, it'll actually give you pretty accurate story points, right? So again, don't want to take the team out of story pointing and doing estimates, but the more and more detail you give it, the faster and faster this goes. So anyhow, so keep that in mind. So that's the user stories, Scrum Master, the persona comes in based on the information that it knows. It goes ahead and points to stories. All right. So cool. And now, so we're going to go and we're thinking about acceptance tests, right? In our process, the next person in is the user acceptance test. So as an acceptance tester, review the feature requirements and provide scenarios that would validate the feature from an end user perspective, highlighting any usability concerns. Right? Certainly. As a UAT, my goal is to ensure that the real-time order tracking feature aligns with the end user expectations. So it's going to validate things like, is it easy to use, intuitive, and is it aligned with real world expectations? And so it's going to come through and the view of the current, given I've logged into my account, navigated to my orders. When I click on a recent order, then I should see out for delivery. And then usability concerns. Status text might be too small or not color coded, hard to differentiate. No hover or click to expand explanation or statuses, right? So in your acceptance criteria, when we created the Gherkin, we typically leave out these kind of details, right? So for an example is it says order status displayed. Maybe you want the order status displayed highlighted in green or whatever your company colors are. Those type of things should be identified, right? So that when the developers in there writing code, they know exactly how to display the message, right? These are things a lot of times that come up where you have to get the UX designer involved on a regular basis, do reviews, or it shows up at the end when you're doing a product owner review and they go, man, it'd be nice if this was highlighted. If we can identify whatever we can identify ahead of time so that we can write the user story and get it to done and be pretty sure it's going to be accepted, the better off we all are. And so what it does is this is the nice thing about these models and looking at it from different personas is that it'll highlight the things that you may know, but you forgot at that point in time. And so you're going to go through, it's going to go through that scenario and then just going to give you a nice summary and then some suggested enhancements, right? Missing error feedback, add alert toast for failed status. So in this case, I've written a lot of JavaScript code. So what it's doing is it's understanding that, hey, this may be JavaScript, even though I haven't told it. And on the front end, and actually it's a typical front end in React, there's this module called Toast that whenever you see that message slide into the bottom in bold and it gives you some information, that's Toast formatting the message and displaying it to the user. So just giving you some tips and hints as to what you could do. And so would you like me to create a UAT checklist? Not at this point, but now what I want to do is I'm going to go back to the product owner, right? So return to your role as a product owner. Based on all the feedback refinements, create your final backlog ready user stories with acceptance criteria. So it's coming back as the product owner role. So now what it's going to do is it's going to take a look at everything that it's done today in this strat, and it's going to give it a view, but it's going to put its product owner role hat back on, right? And so the goal is to enable users to monitor orders from placement through delivery to data, status update, live location tracking, notifications, improving transparency. So here's your story one. As a logged in user, I want to see the current status and full history of my order, place confirmed, out for delivery, so that I can understand where the order is in the fulfillment process and feel confident about its progress. That's a pretty good user story, right? Here's the acceptance criteria. Order detail page displays vertical and horizontal status tracker with clearly labeled phases. So that's a pretty clear requirement from the product owner on how how they want it displayed. That wasn't mentioned the first time we generated our user stories, right? Each status has a timestamp and description. Statuses are updated automatically via a webhook or polling from the carrier's APIs. User can view the full status and history. Status text and icons are readable on both desktop and mobile, right? So it's identifying some things you're going to need to test. And then it goes through and describes dependencies. So you can see that this user story is, let's take a look at this, and pardon the scroll for a second, but user story one. Now let's take a look. Here was the user story when we first started, right? Without considering this concept of metaprompting. This is create a user story. If we all looked at this user story, we'd probably be like, hey, yeah, no, this is pretty good to get started, right? And then we're going to collaborate. Compare that to this user story. Not any more complicated, right? But more information, better acceptance criteria. And along the way, we've created some artifacts that the developers can use in their development environment, right? And so now live map and ETA tracking, right? Much better, right? As a customer in active delivery, live vehicles refresh, right? How often do we refresh? ETA is dynamically updated and visible under the map. Again, I do want to beat this horse, is that look at the user story before, right? And so this was quickly done, right? This was done through just this kind of back and forth and changing the persona and chaining our prompts together, right? And so here's the third user story. Very good. So sprint planning nodes. Story one can be started immediately, foundational and minimal third-party risks. Story three can be worked in parallel, back-end logic and preferences. And then story two, right? So basically it's looking at all the information and the dependencies in the flow and helping you understand what's the correct priority to do in your user stories, right? And so now you can continue on and following the prompts, but what I would suggest here is you go ahead and wait. So let's go back through and just talk about what we did. So we started off as a product owner and we asked it to just create some user stories for us. And so did a pretty good job of that. And then we went to the UX designer and they went through and they looked at and they evaluated the story from a user experience perspective. And they went through and identified some things that they're going to do, and they'll probably go off on their own, use Figma, and now create some wireframes that they can attach to the user stories. And then senior developer persona went and evaluated the stories as senior developer for technical feasibility, requirements, performance considerations, security implications. Then a solution architect came in and looked at the technical design. Then your QA engineer came in, created acceptance criteria in a given when-then format, a structured format that then could be used for development, right? And then Scrum Master came in and looked at the user stories and based on history and information, pointed to stories. Now, again, context is king, right? So in this story pointing exercise, the LLM's going to use what it knows in the universe as to average story points for these type of tasks or how long it estimates they're going to take. Now, if you feed in your own information, right? Maybe some history of user stories, how long they took, and how you pointed them. This great information the Scrum Master can be collecting after the fact, the sprints. And then the story pointing would be pretty accurate, like almost perfect. I've seen it and it's pretty cool. And then you come in and you think about user acceptance tests. Again, what's nice about this is that if you create them in Gherkin, they can be automated. And now you're doing your user acceptance testing inside your sprint and not an afterthought at the end, right? Where you need a third-party team. Then the product owner came back in and refined the user story based on all the information they had. They reformatted the user story, cleaned up the acceptance criteria, gave it better clarity, and then based on dependencies that were identified by the technical reviews, reordered the priority of the user stories, right? And so now let's do something a little extra cool, but very doable for the LLM, right? So let me go find this again. Now, I know a lot of people say that this is going to take away development jobs, but I don't believe that to be true. But let me show you something. So this alone, if you stopped right here, this is a great series of meta prompts, right? So this is a prompting that goes through and basically the whole concept is that you want to use the language model to validate itself. And this is just a kind of a meta prompting tip in general. Whenever you go in and you ask ChatGPT to do something. It could be that you want to create a resume. So you take it, you feed all your information in and you say, hey, create my resume for me and format it in a Word document. That's cool. And you'll probably, if you feed all your resume information in, it'll rewrite some sentences for you. And then it might be done. And then you can turn around and say, review my resume for outcome-focused bullet points and identify where I could increase the value of the perception of my resume by being more outcome-focused. So now what you're doing is you're taking the prompt and you're having it look at what it developed and evaluate your information based on outcomes. And it'll give you some tips. And then you can come back through and say, given what you know about ATS, the application tracking systems, score my resume based on this job description. And so now you can give it a JD and it'll bang it up against it and it'll give you a percentage score. But the point here is that what you're doing is you're leveraging the LLM to evaluate itself. And there have been studies that have found that the generation in the first pass is pretty good. But if you have it evaluate its own generated output, it'll evaluate it and you'll get the next level will be much better. So you saw that in our case, right? We looked at user story 1 and we took it through the process. So we took it through this process flow, right? So we took user story 1 from a product owner. They created a user story. Then they gave it to the UX designer for review, right? Chaining these response. UX designer reviewed it, came up with ideas and identified things that now the product owner can be thinking about when they're thinking about how they want to finalize the user stories. Senior developer, again, all of this stuff goes into memory. We get down to the end where we now give in the process with the product owner, and the product owner does a final review and then redefines the user stories. And we saw that user story 1, not bad, probably an average user story, down to when we got to the end, that user story was pretty tight, right? It was a pretty good user story. So those are the kind of things that we want to be thinking about when I talk about prompt chaining, right? Now, so let's go to this. Let's go to the cool thing. So I think I copy and paste this. So now If you have all of this information, you can now say, because I use Gherkin, which is a structured framework that developer can use. There's application, if you're using Java or JavaScript, there's, I think Cucumber is Java, but so there are variants for the different programming languages because this is text-based and you need to convert it into methods that would be used by your IDE or by your code base, right? Whether it's JavaScript, Python, whatever. So what I'm going to say here is at this point, we've gotten our user stories to the point where we like them. So we're going to say use Gherkin that you created and use the Gherkin that you created. And the updated user stories and generate code to pass the Gherkin test, use solid principles. Solid principles, for those who aren't developers, are, I forget all the acronyms, but basically what it is, it's thinking about things like separation of concerns, a single responsibility principle. And basically what it does is it's going to structure the code base so that it's object oriented. If the language can handle OO, if not, it'll just separate it out. And so now instead of just creating one stream of code, it's creating something that a seasoned developer would create, right? And so I'm also going to tell it to build a complete project structure so that I can look at the structure and hopefully at the end, what I want to be able to do is just cut and paste the code in, right? And so I'm going to go through and then I'm going to tell it, hey, this is going to be written in TypeScript and I'm going to use Cucumber to test the step definitions, and I'm going to use Jest for my unit test framework. And then I may have some configuration files. So now I'm going to go ahead and feed this to the LLM and it's going to, so here's what it's doing, right? This is nice. So it comes back and it says, okay, here's the structure that we're going to use. Here's your order tracking system. Here's how the source, the domain, you can have entities for your order status and services, infrastructure, and your interfaces, and go down through and additional user stories. Let's see what it's doing. Okay, so then it's going to come over and start to give us our code, right? See this? Not only that, it's telling us exactly how to set it up. So here's the initial project. It's walking the developer through how to set this project up, right? Here's configuration files, exports, packages, and you can continue down this path. Now, the thing is that there are other code. So so here we go. So this is what I was waiting for. So let me know. Okay. Let me know and I'll start writing the actual code. We'll start with, okay, please continue. And so what it's going to do is you can see it's going down the structure that I hadn't seen it do this before. That's pretty sweet. So what it's doing is it's going down the structure and it's writing the code. So basically what it's telling me is that if I create this folder structure and then have an order.ts, this is the code I want to drop in. And then here's the order status type, because TypeScript, it's going to be type safe so that as I'm building the code, it'll let me know if I'm doing something wrong. But what I want you to be thinking about while everybody's sitting here, you might be going, so it's generating code. We don't have time in this video for me to drop this code into an IDE, but I recently did this. In that case, I used a Claude, the newer version 3.7, and had it generate code for a React front end for, let me see if I have it up, if it's up and running. Okay, so this may not look like much, but this React front end it's mimicking a chat. It wrote all of this code and it's interactive. Now I don't have it hooked up in the back end. So if I type a message, dog outside. I don't know why I'm typing. It's outside. Now I'm going to get an error because it's not hooked up to my API. Okay. But all of this code completely written by Claude. I didn't do it. I didn't do anything other than there was a configuration issue with installing Tailwind, which is the thing that formats, makes it look pretty like it's a CSS type library. But my point is that what I don't want to do is get all caught up in, oh my God, we don't need developers anymore, because it's not true. If you saw in our process, we do need the developers as we're doing this prompt. You see the type of things that are coming up. What we always wanted to do as Agilists is what? Wanted to increase the feedback loop, right? Decrease the time from concept to delivery, right? So if we can go through this structured process, right? Use the LLM to do metaprompting, get it to the point where we have things that are clearly defined. Then as developers and these IDEs get better at generating a first pass of code, then a developer could go into their environment, take in the more detailed, or take in the user stories with the acceptance criteria and say, generate the first pass of code, right? Now, the more that this is inside of a development environment with the architecture, the tools are getting better and better now, and they can understand the context of your code base. Now, if your code base is huge, that's a little bit of a problem. But if you divide it up in microservices, if you're inside of a microservice, it understands that code really well, and it can help you integrate and implement things. So again, let's not focus on, wow, where does this take us in the future? Let's think about today. What is it that we need to do today? And what we need to do today is we need to decrease the feedback loop, right? We want to get to the point where we have code that a product owner can look at, and then the product manager can get into the hands of customers and users, and they can touch it and feel it and give us feedback, right? So if you think more about using your prompting as meta prompts, how can I leverage the LLM to do a lot of the things that took me a lot of time? Think about the amount of time that you take to, first of all, craft your user stories, get a Three Amigos meeting together, right? We typically have them scheduled a couple hours, at least once a week, maybe a couple times a week. We're looking at new user stories as they come in, and we're doing some refinement to get them ready for prioritization. If you go through this meta prompting, we did this in actually the whole prompting part took 30 minutes. And I'll put a link. If you come in with a really clear problem statement or an epic build off a really clear problem statement, I have a GPT out there. If you go to the GPT store, and I'll add a link to it, it's called the Problem Statement Assistant. And what it'll do is it'll take the product owner through the typical 5 whys. And again, you can do this as a collaboration. If you saw my user story mapping video that I did with Lucid, and basically I tied the two into using Lucid Lucid charts. And the first part of that was using that GPT to go through a 5 whys and the yellow hats to do a refinement and get good measurements on the problem statement. If you start with a good problem statement and the product owner came in and said, with this problem statement, create user stories. Doesn't have to be 3. It could be create the user stories for this problem statement. Again, then what you want to do is this concept of metaprompting. Go through these prompts. No reason you can't refine them to make them more specific to your environment, how you want the user stories written, how you want to estimate them, all of that stuff. You can get through this process in 30 minutes. Typically, this has taken us days, weeks, sometimes, right? To get to the point where we can actually give an estimate. Think about how powerful this is if somebody comes to you with a problem and says, hey, how long do you think this would take? You could, again, keep in mind, we still want to collaborate, right? No reason why we can't have an hour meeting. We go through and we have our meta prompts ready. We get the team together and we go through and we walk through letting the LLM drive, team reviews, makes modifications, right? You can interject as you go. But as you can see, if you just take it through this flow, what's going to happen is the LLM is going to generate really good user stories and acceptance criteria for you. And then the end result are going to be really powerful user stories. You drop them in Jira, you have your prioritization. And then again, if the developers are comfortable with using these models to generate code, then they can generate. You saw that I generated that code, and that took I didn't do anything, right? All I did was give it a good prompt and it generated the code. And when you're generating code, you want to really be careful with how you prompt it, right? Because you want to make sure that it's following the solid principles and that it's breaking your code apart. Otherwise, you get a big monolith of code and it's more difficult to debug, right? So once again, going to keep saying this. Metaprompting is the key. This isn't just for user stories. I gave you the example of the resume and you want to evaluate it. These are the type of things that you should be doing every time you prompt. Always use ChatGPT. And when I say LLM, I'm talking about a large language model. Those are the models that are behind these front ends. So ChatGPT has OpenAI. Claude's got an Anthropic model. I forget what it might just be called. It might be Claude. Sorry. But those are the models in the back end. And so again, if you want training, if you want to understand better how to do this type of meta prompting, give me a call or reach out to me on LinkedIn. I train teams on how to do this type of stuff. And it's specific. It can be very specific to your role. For example, here's a series of prompts that I use in the GPT that I'll give you access to. This is the internals of the GPT. So what I do is you can break it down, you give the model tasks to do, and basically the way you speak to it. So for example, I want to go through a 5 whys. If you prompted ChatGPT right now, say, hey, let's go through a 5 whys for this problem. What it would do is it would dump out 5 questions. That's not what you want to do, right? So you want to think about how you prompt this. So if you think about what you want to do with the 5 whys is you want to ask the first question and then wait, right? You don't need to say wait, but you want to say ask first question and then you modify each successive whys depending on the previous answer. So what that'll instruct the model to do is it'll come back and it'll ask you the first why and you'll answer the first why. Then it'll look at the problem and how you answered the first why, and it'll generate a second why. So now what's happening is that the whys that are being asked are driving you down through the critical thinking path to get to what the real issue is, right? And so these are the type of things that you want to be thinking about when you're building your prompts. Okay. Again, if you want training in this, I train teams. I can walk you through, I customize the training by team member and role, right? Because obviously you have different deliverables based on the role. And everything is using meta prompts to help you meta prompt yourself, if that makes sense. So anyway, all right. Thank you guys. Appreciate the time.